The night he came home smelled like jet fuel and rain, and I almost forgot how to breathe. After months counting sand-stung sunrises, I could finally count freckles on his cheeks again. A uniform rustled, a duffel thumped, and our hands found each other. From deployment to date night, love moved in small, steady steps. A doorway, a smile, a whispered promise that we were still us. Softer now, stronger somehow. We learned patience, and we learned to come home. If this story warms your heart, please like, subscribe, share, and comment your support for love and our veterans today. I used to think love arrived like a brass band, all trumpets and cymbals and confetti that clings to the cuffs of your jeans. That was before Caleb. With him, love arrived like a porch light turning on at dusk. It was warm and steady. It didn't ask for attention. It offered it freely, waiting for you to come home. The first time I met him, he was trying to return a book he'd never actually borrowed. He stood at the counter of the library where I worked part-time, holding a dog-eared paperback with the kind of careful respect that makes you think of church. The book was a romance, the kind with a cover that tried to hide how tender it was by pretending to be about a historical war. I liked that. It made me smile. "I think this belongs to someone," he said, his voice low as if he were telling a secret. "Found it on a park bench." He looked like someone who had their life packed into tidy boxes, clean lines, neat haircut, a watch that kept honest time. His name tag, clipped to the front of a gray hoodie, read Ortiz, C., but his eyes gave him away. They were soft in the corners, like a map that's been folded and unfolded so many times the creases become part of the story. He smiled back when I smiled at the book, and that was the start. He came back a week later to ask for recommendations, that time in uniform, the green and sand colors turning the library into a place where two kinds of quiet met. He didn't say much about his job, just that he was a medic, and he had a talent for wrapping things the right way, bandages and gifts and words. He asked for stories about people who learned how to stay. I sent him home with 3 paperbacks and a list of my favorite lines. He returned with a bag of empanadas he'd made himself, embarrassed as if bringing food was too intimate for a library counter. I told him I was raised to never turn down a kindness. He nodded like he understood that rule already. We knew about deployment the way people know about winter. It's there before it arrives, and it has a way of making its presence felt in the small preparations, the way you start saving, the way you double knot loose ends. The first time he said the word, he was honest about it. "It might be a year," he said, stirring sugar into my coffee with a spoon too big for the cup. "Maybe less. They're saying maybe 6 months, but the word they use most is maybe." I remember setting down my mug and setting my hand over his. I remember thinking of all the ways I could tell him yes without making a promise I couldn't keep. I said, "Then I'll learn 100 new ways to make maybe feel like we're still us." He laughed then, the kind of laugh that lifts you a little higher than you were standing. "You're good with words, Nate." "I just mean them," I said, and that was the truth. We made a list that night, in neat pencil on a cheap notepad from the pharmacy. We called it the Someday List. It had lines like learn to make his mom's enchiladas and teach him to like my sad jazz playlists and have a date night that lasts too long. We wrote go to a baseball game and pretend we know the rules. We wrote drive to the lake and argue over who packed the better snacks. We wrote hold hands in public and then forget we're doing it. He left in the rain because of course he did. He left from the base 2 towns over, in a bus that had curtains on the windows like anyone could ever hide what was happening behind fabric. I tucked notes into his duffel where I thought he might find them. He tucked a note into the pocket of my jacket where he knew I'd find it on the walk home. I did, and it said, "Make sure you eat breakfast." That was so him it made me cry on the sidewalk. Forehead pressed to a telephone pole like it was an altar. The first week he was away, the house sounded like it had been louder all this time, and I just hadn't noticed until quiet fell like snow. His toothbrush stood brave in a cup next to mine. The dent his body made in the couch remained. The dog, Pepper, a terrier mix who always looked like she'd escaped a wind tunnel, kept checking the front door and giving me that look dogs give when they're trying to be your refuge. I made breakfast because I promised him I would. I ate standing up because I was afraid of sitting down at the table and seeing the empty chair that had already become a story. We figured out time zones the way kids figure out secret handshakes, with sincerity and mistakes and way too much excitement over how it worked. Our best window was my late evening and his early morning, him with sand still in the corners of his eyes and me still in the clothes I wore to work. Sometimes there was video. Sometimes there was just a voice. Sometimes there was a message that said, "Can't call tonight. I love you. Save me the story of your grocery store run. You always make it sound like a documentary." It turned out the grocery store could be dramatic if you were looking for it. There was the time I asked the clerk if the apples were on sale, and she said, "Honey, everything's on sale if you smile, right?" And then refused to let me pay full price for a single apple because she liked my scarf. There was the time I almost bought a mountain of cereal because it reminded me of his habit of making midnight bowls, crunch echoing in the quiet while we watched old movies and invented outlandish backstories for the minor characters. I sent him photos of Pepper sitting politely next to the couch and a video of the porch swing creaking like someone telling a story in an old rocker. He sent me photos of sunrise that looked like every sunrise and also like no sunrise I had ever seen. He sent me a picture of his hand holding a paper cup of coffee and said, "This tastes like gasoline and hope." Letters became our anchor. We wrote even when we could text, because there's a way ink works that pixels can't manage. He wrote on whatever he had. Notebook paper, the back of a printed map, a page from a manual he said he hoped no one would miss. I wrote on thick paper that made my pen glide. It felt like a small luxury we could afford. He drew little cartoons of a stick figure version of us, always holding hands, occasionally with Pepper wearing a cape. I sent crosswords I'd made where the answers were the names of our favorite diners and our least favorite weather. On Sundays, I took coffee to Mrs. Alvarez next door. She had a son who'd gone overseas years ago and hadn't come back the same, and she taught me how to leave space for a person to be quiet without making it feel like you were abandoning them. "Make dinner and set a place for him," she said, her hands moving in an invisible recipe. "When he gets home, he'll need to know you kept room for him in all the simple ways." On Tuesdays, I hosted a small group at the library that we called Letter Club. There were 6 of us, sometimes 4, sometimes 9. We wrote to our people. We wrote to strangers, veterans in hospitals, service members we'd never meet. We wrote like we were teaching our hands to keep memory. The group wasn't therapy, but it felt like a kind of healing all the same. One night, Mr. Patel, the pharmacist who'd retired 3 months prior and now needed reasons to leave his house that weren't just the hardware store, told me, "You know what you're doing? You're weaving a net. When he falls back into your life, there's something there to catch him. It's not fancy, but it's strong." There were hard days, too. The day of the blackout, for instance. The call dropped to static and then to nothing, and the nothing went on long enough for me to forget to breathe. You learn during that kind of waiting that fear is a noisy neighbor. It's always dropping things and slamming doors. I took Pepper for a walk around the block. I stopped at the crosswalk and held on to the cold metal of the pole like it could ground me. I repeated out loud, "He is okay. He is okay." When the call came the next morning, his voice was tired and so gentle I wanted to fold myself into it like a blanket. "I'm okay," he said. "I'm okay. Write this down. I'm okay." So I did. I wrote it on a sticky note and on a page of the calendar and on the back of my hand. I wrote it across the mirror in dry erase marker. By evening, I had made soup and delivered a container to Mrs. Alvarez. And when she asked how I was, I said, "He's okay." And we both nodded like that was its own prayer. We made a tradition of sharing small joys. On Wednesdays, he told me 3 nice things that had happened to him. No matter how small. A kid taught me to say hello in Pashto, or I found a pebble shaped like a heart, or the medic tent got a box of cookies from a church in Missouri, and they came with a drawing of a dinosaur to keep watch. I told him my 3. Pepper learned how to wait until I say go before she eats, or the barista drew a smiley face inside the O of Nate on my cup, or I finally replaced the squeaky hinge on the back door. There's a rhythm to joy when you practice it. It picks up pace. It becomes a metronome for the heart. And then the day happens. The day the calendar has been leaning toward like a sunflower toward a window. Sometimes it wiggles. Dates move. Planes get delayed. Buses pull off at strange hours. But the day comes. For us, it came in the kind of rain that doesn't make a big deal out of itself. Steady and quiet, like it knows you have other things on your mind. The Armory parking lot had puddles that reflected a sky trying to decide if it was going to clear. Families clutched posters with glitter that stubbornly stuck to everything it touched. I stood there holding a mug of coffee I didn't drink because my hands needed something to do. Pepper had a bandana that read "Welcome Home," which she wore with the seriousness of a job. The doors opened and bodies came out, and for a moment I saw only a wave, the kind that moves all at once. And then, as if someone had turned the focus dial on an old camera, I saw him. He was smaller and bigger somehow, the same and different. That's how it works. He set his duffel down like he was setting down a part of himself he'd held tightly for too long. He looked around in quick, careful arcs until he found my face. And then we did that thing that people who've waited do. We moved toward each other like there was no space between us to begin with. The hug was not gentle and it was not rough. It was all of it. It was the thing we had both been carrying. His face pressed into my neck, and I could feel him breathe, and that felt like the world returning to a rhythm I understood. You don't get a guidebook for after. The movies fade to credits. The banners come down. The casseroles are eaten. And then there's a Tuesday in a quiet kitchen where he reaches for a glass and doesn't remember where we keep them anymore. Or there's the sound of a car backfiring, and he goes still as a tree in winter, and you put your hand on his back and feel the tremor. There's the day you accidentally leave a pair of boots near the door, the way he used to, and you both laugh because you both know it wasn't an accident. There's the first morning you make pancakes and the batter is too runny, and you both eat them anyway with a ridiculous amount of syrup and a gratitude that tastes like butter. Date. Night, he said on that first Friday, like he was testing out the words to see if they still fit. He wore a shirt I'd given him before he left, the one with tiny blue anchors. It was too loose on his shoulders. He looked down at the fabric, smoothed it like you do when you want something to feel okay again. I want to take you out. I want to do it right. We'll do it our way, I said, pulling open the cabinet to show him where the fancy plates lived, the ones we never used because we were saving them for occasions. I think we've earned the right to call tonight an occasion. We lit candles that had been a gift from my aunt, the kind that smelled like cedar and something sweet. He set the table like he always did, with care that bordered on reverence. He still remembered that I like my fork on the left and my napkin folded into something that resembles a swan in a very forgiving light. He made enchiladas using a recipe his mom had texted me when he was gone, including notes about where not to be shy with the cheese. I made a salad and fussed over the dressing because fussing felt like another word for love. We put on a record that crackled in the corners, the way all good memories do. I could tell you it was perfect, and maybe it was. Maybe perfect doesn't mean smooth. Maybe it means honest. The conversation was like a road with curves, sometimes open and bright, sometimes shaded and slow. We talked about the someday list. We crossed off some things. We added others. Learn how to be patient with fireworks, he said, and I wrote it down carefully. Not because I wanted to fix anything, but because writing it felt like saying I'm here. He said, "Tell me the story of the grocery store like a documentary," and I did. And he laughed at all the right parts. The next week, we took date night to a little diner with a neon sign that buzzed like it had secrets. He chose a booth in the back. I sat across from him, and every time he looked up from the menu at me, I felt that thud in my chest that reminded me my heart wasn't just for keeping me alive. It was for telling me when I was exactly where I needed to be. The waitress called us sweethearts, like we were from a time when people said that word without irony. She brought us extra napkins and a slice of pie on the house. "Welcome home," she said to him, like it was the simplest, truest thing she could say. He wore his watch, the one that had seen both dust and rain. His wrist was leaner. His eyes had new edges to them. He looked at the slices of lemon floating in his water like he was memorizing the way they moved. "The noise," he said, quiet. "Sometimes it feels like everything is happening at once." I said, "We can leave whenever you want," and he said, "No, I want to learn how to stay again." So we learned. We learned the kind of staying that involves listening for the sounds you don't have to worry about. The clink of a fork, the soft whoosh of the door. He learned that he could put his back to the wall and relax his shoulders. I learned to notice when his breathing evened out. The little tell sign that said, "There you are." On Saturdays, we went to the farmer's market and bought too many tomatoes because they were all shaped like hearts if you tilted your head. He talked to an older man selling honey about beekeeping with a curiosity that made me fall in love again for reasons that would sound small to anyone who hasn't loved a person through a long absence. The way he asked questions, the way he listened, the way his mouth softened around the word "thank you." I watched him navigate a crowded aisle, his hand finding mine without looking, like we were a thing his body remembered on its own. We went to a baseball game once. The rules were still a mystery, but the hot dogs were perfect. We sat in the shade. He leaned against me during the seventh-inning stretch like leaning was a second language he still spoke fluently. He told me about a friend of his who used to hum the national anthem under his breath when he needed to steady his nerves. Not because of any grand, sweeping patriotism, but because the tune was a rope he could hold on to, familiar and strong. I thought about how we all carry our ropes, our hymns, our little songs. I thought about how mine had become the sound of his laugh. You learn that coming home is a season, not a day. It arrives and settles and then surprises you. The way you turn a corner in your own house and see it like a stranger and like the oldest friend. He started sleeping better when we found a rhythm for the evenings. We turned the porch swing into a ritual. 2 cups of tea, 1 lemon, 1 honey, pepper at our feet, the streetlight buzzing soft. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. Silence became a way to say, "I'm here," without making the other person work for it. Sometimes he'd tell me a story that began in the desert and ended in our kitchen. In the soft way routine can be a form of healing. He would say, "I learned a trick for folding bandages so they're quick." And then he'd fold a dish towel like it was a bandage, and the practical beauty of it would make me catch my breath. It's funny what we find beautiful when we're paying attention. There were bumps. Of course there were. The time the fireworks went off earlier than anyone expected in the park down the street, and he flinched so hard the glass he was holding slipped, and I watched it fall in slow motion and shatter. He said, "I'm sorry," like he'd broken something important and irreparable, and I said, "You're here," because that was more important than glass. I swept while he sat, shoulders like drawn bows. Later we talked about making a plan for fireworks. We made a chart like a kid would make with boxes we could check. Noise-canceling headphones, checking the community calendar, having a quiet place we both knew to go. It sounds small. It wasn't small. It was a declaration that we would handle the future by planning for it together. On an ordinary Tuesday, we went to the clinic for his intake appointment. They asked smart questions. He answered them with a clear voice. The woman behind the desk had a little flag pin on her collar and eyes kind enough to trust. She gave us a pamphlet on sleep hygiene that mostly said, "Go to bed at the same time every night," which made us both laugh because it sounded like something your grandma would tell you while putting a quilt on your legs. That night, we went to bed at the same time we did the night before, and it felt like a small victory. He took to cooking like a man who understood that work with your hands makes a kind of sense the brain craves. He made stews that simmered all afternoon, filling the house with the kind of aroma you wish you could send like a letter. I baked bread from a recipe that belonged to my father. It came out crooked and perfect. We began the tradition of writing a gratitude note at the end of date night, something simple on a card we stored in a little wooden box. One night he wrote, "Thank you for not asking me to be any different than I am." I wrote, "Thank you for teaching me that love is mostly small, repeated treasons against loneliness." We didn't post our date nights on social media. That wasn't a rule. It just happened that way. But we shared a few photos with our people, his mom, my sister, the letter club. We shared like you share cake, enough to let people taste your joy while keeping a slice for yourselves. The comments were gentle. The one that made me tear up was from a man named Joe we didn't know, who wrote, 45 years married to my guy this June. Keep eating pancakes. It's the secret." One Friday, we took date night on the road, just to the edge of town, where fields met a stretch of old road that no one seemed to drive after 7. We brought a blanket. We lay on our backs and named the handful of stars we could see past the orange glow of the city. He pointed and said, "That's probably a plane," and we both waved anyway, because you never know who's up there, making their way towards someone who is waiting. He said, "I want to tell you something," and I said, "You can tell me anything," because we had been practicing that the way you practice scales until they are second nature. He said, "Sometimes I feel between two places. Like my body is here and part of me is still looking out at that horizon." I nodded. He kept going. "I don't want that to scare you." I took his hand. "It doesn't scare me," I said. "It helps me understand where to stand, so I can be near you wherever you are." He squeezed my fingers. "You always make things sound simple," he murmured, which I think is one of the kindest lies anyone has ever told me. "We let our hometown be our playground." Date night wasn't always candles and red sauce. Sometimes it was a hardware store, picking paint chips for a wall we hadn't decided to repaint yet. Sometimes it was an afternoon volunteering at the community center packing boxes of food, our shoulders bumping as we lined up cans like you line up hope. Sometimes it was a matinee at the little theater that smelled perpetually like popcorn and dreams. We sat in the back and pointed out the scenes that felt too neat and the ones that felt true in the way uncomfortable truths are. We whispered jokes only we would get, and I thought to myself, this is what forever can look like. The quiet moments where you don't have to perform for anyone. He had a scar I hadn't seen before, a little crescent near his elbow. He caught me looking and said, "Caught my arm on something that thought it was meaner than me." And then he kissed my hair like that was the end of it. There were other scars, too. Some you can't see. But they all told stories of how a person makes their way back to themselves. We learned together how to ask, "Do you want to talk about it?" and how to receive the answer, whichever way it leaned. We learned to say, "What do you need right now?" and mean it. Once his answer was, "Can we sit on the floor?" I don't know why that feels better, but it does. So we did. We ate pizza sitting on the rug, Pepper resting her head on his knee, and it turned out the floor is a fine place to be when you're grounded by love and mozzarella. I thought a lot about the porch light, about how many nights of my life I hadn't noticed it. Flicking on to announce the day's slow surrender. After he came home, I noticed the light and the way he would look at it like even the house was glad to see him. I noticed my own heartbeat when he came in from taking out the trash and said, "Hey," like it was a gift to say hello. I noticed that date night had stopped being an event and started being a practice. We practiced showing up. We practiced apologizing for small things before they became big things. We practiced feeding the part of us that got hungry for gentleness. One night, months after the banners had been recycled into boxes and the casseroles were distant memories, and the routine was a soft blanket over our days, he brought out the someday list. He had kept it folded in his wallet through the desert and the return. The edges were soft as old linen. He set it on the table and flattened it with his palm. "We've done some of these," he said. "We've done them in our own way." He read aloud. "Hold hands in public and then forget we're doing it." He looked up, smiling. "We did that on Tuesday, walking past the bakery." I nodded. I remembered the smell of cinnamon and the way our palms fit, unremarkable and extraordinary at the same time. He kept reading. "Have a date night that lasts too long." "We started dinner at 6 and ended at 11, I said. "That counts," he chuckled. "Teach him to like my sad jazz playlists." He raised an eyebrow. "Debatable," I admitted. "I wouldn't say like, but I have learned to tolerate with affection." We laughed, the kind of laugh that's all oxygen. There were lines we hadn't done. "Drive to the lake and argue over who packed the better snacks," he read. We looked at each other like two people who suddenly had a plan. We packed the cooler with grapes and prosciutto and a sad little tub of hummus that turned out to be surprisingly cheerful. We argued yes with faux ferocity, and he won yes because he had the good crackers. We spread a blanket. The water lapped like an old song. He rested his head on my thigh and closed his eyes. The sky was a patchwork of gray and blue. Pepper chased a goose and then pretended she hadn't. A boy with a fishing pole asked if we had any extra worms, and we told him we were strictly a no-worm household. He squinted at us like we were missing out on an entire worm-based experience. We made it a rule that date night didn't have to be Friday. It was a moving holiday. It could be a Monday morning when he was up early and I didn't have to be at the library until 10. Pancakes and a walk and a promise to tell each other one new story we hadn't told yet. Turns out you accumulate stories in the course of a life, and sometimes you forget to share them. He told me about the time he tried to grow tomatoes in a foam cooler when he was 12. I told him about the night my father taught me to change a tire on a car we didn't own, just so I'd know. We found ourselves new again in the telling. Sometimes people ask, "What's the secret?" As if love is a safe you can crack with the right combination of numbers and hard-earned guesses. I don't know the secret. Maybe there isn't one. But I know this. We made things anyway. We made dinner when the day was heavy. We made plans when the future felt blurry. We made space when the room felt too small. We made eye contact when it would have been easier to look down. We made a habit of saying, "How's your heart?" and genuinely waiting for the answer. We made each other laugh on purpose. We made a home that had space for all the versions of us. The tired ones, the brave ones, the curious, the aching, the soft. There were days he needed the quiet of the backyard, where the fence didn't try to be anything besides a fence and the grass, left alone, did its best to grow. He'd sit there with Pepper and a book he wasn't reading, and I'd bring iced tea and a bowl of cherries. Sometimes the sun would find his face through the leaves like it was checking in. "I'm okay," he'd say, a phrase that had become both mantra and map. "I know," I'd say. "I know, and I'm here." On our anniversary, years on the calendar that felt both bigger and smaller than we could wrap words around, we kept it simple. He made the enchiladas again. I made the salad again. We used the fancy plates because it turns out they hold just as much love as the regular ones. We read a few of the letters we'd sent each other, like we were reading aloud a history of us. He ran his finger along a sentence he'd written on a page, creased from heat and handling. "Save me the story of the grocery store." He looked up. "You did," he said. "You saved me 1,000 little stories." We danced in the kitchen to a scratchy record, slow and 10 degrees off key. My cheek on his shoulder, his hand on my back, the world narrowing to the safe circle of us. We didn't talk about the future like it was a cliff. We talked about next week, about next month, about the Apple Festival in September. We talked about the neighbor's new baby and how we'd bring over casseroles and leave before anyone felt obligated to offer us tea. We talked about buying a second porch chair so guests wouldn't have to hover. We talked about getting Pepper a new bandana because she had, inevitably, chewed the welcome home one into something that looked like modern art. I want to tell you this, because stories like this sometimes pile all their weight into grand gestures and big reveals. The best part of our date nights isn't just the candles or the pie or the cricket song outside the screen door. It's the way he reaches for the light switch on his way into the kitchen, not because he needs to, but because he knows I always forget, and he likes to save me the small stub of a toe. It's the way I put his favorite mug at the front of the cabinet so he doesn't have to reach too high when the morning is still a slow climb. It's the way we both know without checking which drawer has the matches and which has the rubber bands, and which is for the odds and ends that defy categorization. It's the way we've learned to ask together, what would make tonight feel like love? He says sometimes that he doesn't want our life to be all about the time he was gone, that he is more than that we are more than that. He's right. We are people who plant basil. We are people who have opinions about pancakes. We are people who know where the softest cardigan is when the day is rough around the edges. We are people who share the last good pickle. We are people whose hands look like they were meant to be held by the others. And yet, and this is important, our life has made room for that middle chapter. The one between deployment and date night. The one we would have skipped if we could. We haven't framed it with gold. We haven't built a shrine. But we haven't shoved it under the bed either. It's on the shelf, between the cookbooks and the novels, where we can reach for it when we need to remember how far we've traveled to get to now. It's marked with little sticky notes of gratitude and grief. It's annotated with our laughter in the margins, like an inside joke we refuse to let sorrow steal. Sometimes, late at night, the city goes quiet, and the only sound is the train a few blocks over, reminding us that even while we sleep, the world is carrying itself forward. He'll say, "Tell me again about the time Mrs. Alvarez taught you how to make those little sugar cookies." And I'll say, "She told me to never trust a recipe that pretends butter doesn't matter." He'll chuckle, and we'll drift into that easy silence. And I'll think, this is what I'll remember. Not the parties or the big proclamations, though those are fine and lovely. I'll remember the train and the soft snore of the dog and the way the porch light spills just a little into the living room and the way the man I love breathes like he's found a soft place to land. One evening, not long ago, we walked past the armory where the buses pull in. The parking lot was empty. The puddles had dried into salt lines that looked like maps. He squeezed my hand once, a little code we'd developed that meant I'm thinking about that day, and I squeezed back. The code for I'm thinking about you thinking about that day. We stood there and didn't make it bigger than it was. We didn't need to. The sky was working on a sunset so spectacular it stopped a cyclist long enough to take a photo. We didn't take a photo. We stood and watched the light do what it always does, soften everything it touches. When we finally turned toward home, he said, "What should we do for date night?" And I laughed because I'd forgotten it was Friday, and because asking the question felt like a victory. "I have an idea," I said. "Let's make breakfast for dinner. Let's call your mom and put her on speaker so she can critique your technique. Let's burn the first batch and eat the second one with jam. Let's make a toast with orange juice like we're celebrating something." He looked at me like he was memorizing the lines of my face for the 1,000th time. "We are celebrating something," he said. "We're celebrating that we made it here." He glanced toward the porch, toward the light that would turn on when the sky asked it to. "We're celebrating that home is not a place you arrive at once. It's a thing you keep making." So we went home. We scrambled eggs and played the record with the crackle. We ate too much jam. We put a fork in the dishwasher and then remembered we're not those people. We washed it by hand. We asked, "How's your heart?" And the answer was steady, and we did not take that for granted. We danced with the dog and she tolerated it for 80 seconds. We laughed and did not keep count. The night he came home smelled like jet fuel and rain. Now the nights smell like sautéed onions and detergent, and a hint of cedar from the candle we light when we want the room to remember that it's held more joy than most places get to witness. From deployment to date night turned out to be a bridge we built one plank at a time, one grocery store documentary, one porch swing, one gently placed fork at a time. We crossed it and we keep crossing it, back and forth, every day we choose to show up. The band doesn't need to play. The confetti can stay in the drawer. The porch light is enough. The fall of his shadow across the kitchen doorway is enough. The simple truth of his voice saying, "I'm home," is enough. And the simple answer I have been practicing for as long as I can remember, hoping to one day get it right, is, "You are."